Thank you. What comes to your mind when you think of the Middle East? Maybe you remember a recent article, a post on social media, or even some headlines on the news. Now I want you to imagine what cycling through the Middle East would be like. Do you think of exotic places and camels in the desert? Or do you think of conflict, ongoing fighting, and perhaps how dangerous it must be crossing the Middle East, let alone on a bicycle? If you thought about conflict, fighting, or something similar, please raise your hand. Quite a few. But you know what's interesting? You're not alone. I vividly remember the weekend I was visiting my parents. It was only a few months until I was about to graduate, and as you can imagine, it didn't take long for them to ask the question I guess every student knows. So, tell us, what are your plans after university? Well, I said, I'm going to cycle 15,000 kilometers from Europe to China through the Middle East. Wait, what? Was their first reaction. It actually took them a while to understand I wasn't joking. But from this moment on, our conversation changed. It is too dangerous, Max. Didn't you see what was on the news? The Middle East is a war zone. You know that, right? What if something happens to you? My family was worried. Worried because of all these terrifying things they had seen on TV and read in the paper. Stories of civil war, bombings, and terror. So despite these stories, why did I decide to do it then? I grew up in Germany, a country where everybody is privileged to have free education. Yet I never saw it as such. When I was a teenager, I was non-stop looking for new excuses to skip school again and again and again. Looking back at it now, I feel quite embarrassed. But back then, I simply didn't see education as a privilege. But a few years later, I was at university, and I moved to Vietnam to do my semester abroad. While studying, I got in contact with the local NGO, and I spontaneously decided to teach kids from the local area. I was amazed by the fact that I never wanted to go to school, and yet here I was, teaching 30 kids who voluntarily signed up for my class in their free time. For the first time, I was confronted by kids who wanted to go to school, but didn't have the opportunity. They didn't have the opportunity simply because they were born in a different country than I was. When my time in Vietnam was over, though, I went back home and I continued with my normal life at university. And you know what? I'm not gonna lie. It only took a few months until what I had experienced in Vietnam and the stories of the kids were not really on my radar anymore. They weren't on my radar anymore until my last semester, and I was catching up with one of my best friends. Together, we wanted to exchange ideas on what to do after university, but eventually, we ended up reminiscing about our semester abroad. Both of us had volunteered, and sharing our stories from Vietnam brought my memory of the kids and what they had shown me back to life. Intuitively, at that moment, we promised each other that once we graduate, we will use what we have learned through our education and try to enable more kids to go to school as well. 1 month of brainstorming later, we had a plan. We wanted to raise 50,000 euros to build an entire school. So, what options do you have if you're a student, you don't have much money, and you want to raise 50,000 euros? I'm sure there are a few, but cycling to China and sharing our adventure on social media to create awareness sounded pretty good to us at the time. It was only a week before the trip was supposed to start, and I was getting overly excited. I remember I came back to my apartment, and I couldn't wait to finally start cycling. I turned on the TV, but all of a sudden, my excitement was gone. The headline on TV, 4 Western cyclists killed. Exactly on the route that I wanted to take. When I was talking to my friends and family, I played it cool. I didn't want them to get even more concerned as they already were. But behind my coolness, I was anxious. I didn't know much about the countries, and I had never really met anyone from there. Yet, subconsciously, whether I wanted or not, I found myself caught up in a situation where a horrific, yet single headline on the news was affecting my opinion about an entire area. And most shockingly, it was affecting my opinion about the people who live there. But I knew I just wasn't going to let a headline on the news decide whether I will try and cycle to China and whether I will try to help these kids. It took me 9 months to get to China. 9 months in which I cycled through 20 countries and I got invited by 100 strangers. 100 strangers who welcomed me as a friend and as part of the community. With some I laughed, with some I shared stories, and with others I simply sat together in silence. I can't recall how many times I was moving my arms like this and I said, Bicicleta, Alemania, de China, to somehow explain my intentions and where I was going. I don't know whether it were my, let's say, fairly average pantomime skills or my attempt to speak the local language, but to my own surprise, it worked, and I got myself understood. Every invitation, whether it be in a shack in a desert or in a buzzing city, was different. Some of the people I stayed with were religious, some traditional, and others were liberal. Often, we couldn't agree, often we didn't share the same opinion or the same beliefs. But you know what? It didn't matter. Because regardless how different we thought we were, there was one thing all of these 100 strangers have shown me. Something we all have in common. So what did we have in common? I was cycling through Turkey, and for everybody who pictures Turkey as the perfect summer holiday destination, let me just tell you, my memory of Turkey looks more like this. It was January, and I was in northern Kurdistan. A part of the country the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs specifically advises not to go. It was brisk negative 15 degrees, and I could literally feel how my blood was slowly leaving my hands and my feet. It was by far the coldest I had ever been in my life. And you know what? At that moment, I was scared. Not necessarily scared of the area I was in, but scared that I could lose a toe. Now, you could argue that it probably wasn't cold enough for that to happen, and me standing here right now, I would agree. But at that moment, I was very far away from analyzing my situation rationally. It was about to get dark, and I was passing a single house. Fortunately for me and my toes, the owner of the house didn't hesitate and invited me inside. His name was Kadir. For the next few hours, Kadir and I shared stories of one another. He told me that when he was my age, it was almost impossible to find a job in his region. So as a last resort, he reluctantly decided to leave his family behind and to find a job in a foreign country. But after a few years, he got so homesick that he wanted to come back. He wanted to spend time with his wife, and he wanted to watch his son grow up. Sadly, though, he continued, his son had recently died in an accident. He told me how hard it had been to go through this as a parent, and that he only wished they could have spent more moments together. I had no idea how Kadir must have felt at that moment, but I was deeply touched that he was willing to share his story and his grief with me. After all, I was a stranger, and he didn't know anything about me. A few months later, I was about to enter Turkmenistan. Based on everything I had read, it's the most repressive country in the world, even more repressive than North Korea. A country where every media is state-controlled and freedom of speech does not exist. I took this photo at the border. The soldiers were going through my belongings, and once they found the camera equipment, I was questioned. This photo shows exactly how I imagined Turkmenistan to be like after reading all these articles online. However, what the photo doesn't show, and that's because I was a little bit nervous to keep filming. No, actually, I was terrified. So what the photo doesn't show is that right after the soldiers were done doing their duty, one of them was walking towards me. He looked as he had pictured this moment many times before, and as he clenched his fist, he looked towards me and said, "What's up, my brother?" expecting me to return his fist bump. In a heartbeat, the mood changed, and all of these terrifying-looking soldiers turned into what they really were. 18-year-old boys who never left their country, who have almost no access to the internet, and who are just really curious about the world outside. Where do you come from? What do you do? What do your parents do? How is life in Germany? Were only a few questions they asked. It reminded me of a time when I was a kid, and everything was new, interesting, and I asked a ton of questions. The moment we shared there felt so raw. But the moment that stuck with me the most happened in Iran. I was arriving in a small town and I checked into a hostel. There were no other tourists, and the owner invited me to stay with him and his wife. His name was Kemran. As days passed by, our conversations got more intimate, and Kemran started to talk openly about growing up in Iran. When he was only 5 years old, his dad was taken at night for addressing social problems in public. For a few years, his family had no idea where they had taken him and whether his dad was still alive. But when he finally returned, he had changed. For the rest of Kemran's childhood, his dad told him that he shouldn't even think of change because every attempt will be blighted by the regime. That the best thing he can do is just to play his part and to always keep quiet in public. When I asked him if he ever thinks about leaving Iran behind, he said, "Yeah, of course I think about it, but it's not that simple. Iran is my home. It's where my family is and the people I love the most. But it's also the place my wife and I would give up on our dream to have children. We would give up on our dream to have children because we would never want them to live in the same country that we do." His words hit me like a brick. I honestly didn't know how to respond, and I still don't. That night, I wrote a promise to myself. A promise that I will share his story and the story of many others with my friends, with my family, and I will share some here with you. Stories of welcoming a stranger with open arms, of being kind to one another, and taking care of the people we love most. Stories that moved me so much that they still affect me here today. So, if there's one thing that Kadir, Kemran, and the 98 other people I stayed with have shown me, it's that it doesn't matter where we grow up or what we believe in, because what we feel and what we go through, the things that drive us every day to go to work and to cherish the people we love most, all these things are universal. That no matter how different we think we are, there's something beyond that, something we can all relate to, something you, we all feel in one way or the other, which connects us. I'm not standing here today to tell you that from now on you should become friends with everybody. And I'm also not trying to say that you should stop watching the news. Our stories are subjective. We believe in different things, and as a matter of fact, I actually believe that watching the news and hearing about conflict and fighting is very important. But the next time you read an article, you see a post on social media, or you watch some headline on the news, I want you to remember that behind every story in the media, there are 100 other stories. Stories we don't hear. Stories of Kadir, Kemran, and the soldiers in Turkmenistan. Stories of people who love, who sacrifice, and who are kind. Stories which are just like ours and make us what we are. Humans. Thank you.